Hello everyone, welcome to the Decode, a podcast series by ZOOP. Today I have Ankita with me from Spice Route Legal. She's an expert at DPDP. She'll be answering some of our questions. So let's get started.
Hi Ankita, thank you for joining us. I think we'll just start with the elephant in the room. So everyone is talking about DPDP. It has been the talk of our community, right? So can you kind of just bring into the light what DPDP is and why it has become such a big talk today?
Okay, so let me try and put it very simply, right? Until now, India's regulation and at least personal data, privacy was covered under the IT Act, the Information Technology Act, which is the 2000 Act. Since then, there haven't been any extensive rules, regulations that have been imposed on companies to kind of evaluate how data is being collected, how consent is being sought, how is it being shared. 2023, the DPDPA is the act that the government brought in force, which is not yet in force, I should say, which was brought to kind of revamp the digital data protection privacy setup of it. It kind of rewrites and reshapes how data has been collected so far, how you are going to collect it, how you want to share it, how do you take your consents. It's a very, very, very comprehensive framework. It's not something that entities in India have dealt with. So definitely why it's the talk of the town. It's going to be a long way for entities to kind of start grappling or even, wrapping their heads around how to implement this particular comprehensive legislation. Some sort of entities have had interactions with a similar law or say maybe parts and bits of them depending upon the sectors that they have been. So say for example, the RBI, when it started realizing that there was a lot of exploitation of data when it came to digital lending, and when it rolled out the digital lending guidelines, brought about the concept of explicit consent. But the DPDPA goes a step beyond, right? Explicit consent is one aspect. Consent also has to be specific. It has to be granular. There has to be purpose limitation. So DPDP is a fairly detailed legislation that entities will have to now kind of deal with for any sort of digital data that they create.
So I think if we talk about data, right, so there are like certain sectors that deal with a lot of data, right? E-commerce being one of them, fintech being another one, right? So what do you think how this will impact the fintech industry today or the finance industry today? Because we have banks, NBFCs, fintechs, right? Everyone follows different kind of regulations. Some come under RBI, some are not, right? So how will this impact them?
So I think the financial services sector specifically, right, and maybe the health sector to some aspect, are going to have a really tough time figure it out compliance with all sorts of laws that I want to start with there. There are two fundamental aspects, at least in my mind, that I think start impacting. Right? One is, of course, incorporating this legislation into their systems design and infrastructure. The second is how do you go about compliance, right? And where do you start? So I think what's very important for all of these entities to start doing this because they have multiple licenses or in many ways governed by different regulators. So SEBI, IRDAI, RBI, PFRB, it may be. One is to kind of map the compliances that stem from these guidelines. Now, let's be real, right? Even these regulations are very fragmented. You have one regulation that might talk about infrastructure. You may have one that talks about data. You have one that kind of talks about sharing of data. So it's very fragmented already the way it exists. Now, taking those bits and pieces, mapping it with the kind of compliances that come with DPDPS is the second task, right? So marrying these legislations and evaluating compliance that kind of sits above all of this and integrates into the system, I think is going to be a task that most players will have to, grapple with and should already start doing if they haven't thought about it. That's one part to it. The second is because a lot of regulated entities partner with fintechs and share data with fintechs for processing purposes, you come up with there is a concept of a data processor under the regulation. Now, the primary obligations under the Act apply to data fiduciaries, which are the entities that are handling the data. So all of these entities will have to now take off ways they're going to impose contractual obligations on the processors to make sure that there's compliance that flows down. So that's going to be step 2. And I think the third and the most important aspect, which I don't think is being looked at enough as of now, because the law is not letting force, is kind of implementing this into your product. What's very, very important is that it's not just a tech and a legal and a compliance aspect. There is a business aspect to it. The way entities market their products, the way they target their customers, the kind of data that they use to do all of these activities, everything's got to be impacted. Which means it's not just your legal compliance and IT teams coming together and doing the compliance activity. It's actually your finance and your business teams and your product teams and your growth teams and your marketing teams that have to sit together, redesigning their products and think of how they're going to actually implement primacy by design into their systems, into their product, into their infrastructure. So I think it's going to impact these three levels.
Okay, so if I would kind of sum it up on high level. So earlier, these fiduciaries who are keeping the data, right? And we used to say they are the owner of the data. Now it's going to be the user who's going to be the owner of the data, and they'll only just have access to it for certain things, right? So that you call purpose. Okay. And the fintechs who are kind of building on top of banks or NBFCs, right? So they'll be the processors here, right? And they will have only certain rights where they can act, and the banks will have, or the fiduciaries will have to keep a tight compliance on top of these fintechs also to ensure that they are compliant too. Absolutely. Perfect. So one thing that I'm able to understand here is that as data fiduciary, right, they will have to kind of start rethinking their systems from the ground up also sometimes, right? And they'll have to think from the governance point of view also that if they have taken a consent, how they'll implement it, right? As part of that, there is a term that is coming up, or an entity that is coming up, which is CMP, Consent Management Platforms or Consent Managers, right? Can you put light to what exactly these entities are and how they can help companies implement this, or maybe what role they'll play here?
Sure. So I think consent managers is a noble concept, at least from India regulation perspective, right? Different jurisdictions have talked about aspects similar, but I think the Indian DPDP is one of the first laws that kind of gives legitimate recognition to consent managers. There are, of course, platforms that exist that the market knows about, but the Indian law comes up with this concept. There are different purposes to this, and let's see how it kind of solves for it, right? So consent managers would primarily be entities that are user-facing, have a fiduciary responsibility to the data principals, right, which allow data principals to kind of give their consent, withdraw their consent, give them an audit trail of who they've shared their consent with, be able to correct the data that they've shared, all through one platform. So it becomes a very important tool for the user and gives a lot of empowerment to the user in terms of how their data is being handled. That's one very important aspect, right? To see how data fiduciaries could benefit with this framework, why, of course, we'd have to see how the law kind of pans out and, how implementation works and how entities adopt with this. But in my perspective, a lot of data fiduciaries could actually benefit by offloading their technical governance to consent managers. So their entire technical bandwidth on developing systems that would manage consent frameworks kind of now be offloaded to a consent manager. So every time a user kind of gives a request to withdraw consent or gives a request to delete data, it can all come to a data fiduciary through a consent manager. Otherwise, they would have to build these systems. So it kind of makes it much easier for data fiduciaries to start complying and kind of offloads that functionality completely.
So if I draw a parallel, right, so when GDPR came, right, so a lot of cookie managers came in, they started managing what cookies you're providing, they became mandatory, right? So even Google Chrome, we heard a lot of things, right? So, okay, now before doing any marketing activity, you need to have the cookie, or you cannot collect events and all those things, right?
Yeah.
Cool. And so when you said that as consent managers will be governing, I'd say the approver from the what you call data principal or as a user, right? And user, if I can approve what data needs to be kind of provided for what purpose, and I can withdraw that, I can change that, right? So a similar concept we have seen in account aggregator also, right? If you see in account aggregators, right? So I'm getting data from one financial entity to another after the consent of the user. So the consent is there too. So how is it how does that stand here? How are they similar, or maybe how are they different?
So actually very interesting, right? But I think the origin of the two regulations was slightly different, right? If I look at the account aggregator framework that was kind of brought in 2016, where a lot of players were using activities such as SMS scraping, which is still being used, or screen scraping, which was done by then, right? To kind of access financial data, where the regulator felt there was a need to protect the data and kind of stop entities from misusing data or using data in a manner that's not secure, where data integrity became very important, right? So that was, I think, to my mind, the rationale and the synthesis of the account aggregator framework. And of course, the data empowerment, the DEPA framework, right? You're right. Consent manager framework, if you look at it and if you look at the illustrations that the act and the rules provide, it's an apple to apple comparison with account aggregator. But yes, there are a few differences in the sense that today an account aggregator is primarily functioning like a consent manager. It is giving user the ability to give the consent, see the purpose for which the data is being connected, have visibility on who the data is going to be shared with, withdraw the consent, and actually enable that entire framework, right? And that's when an account aggregator would being another financial institution, collect the data. Account aggregator is data blind, of course, and then transmits it to another entity. That's in a nutshell how an account aggregator works. In principle, the consent manager framework's very similar to how an account aggregator operates. The only difference is that today the account aggregators can cater only the financial information, is regulated by the RBI, whereas the DPDP consent manager framework is sector agnostic. You could be using it across sectors. You could be using it for different purposes of data. It's not tied down to one sector or one type of data. So you could have consent manager that's providing a consent management platform to a user across my health data, my insurance data, my financial data. But then again, the moment they start touching upon financial data, the question is, do they need to be an account aggregator? Because that's carved out by the RBI to be a separate entity that's regulated. So yes, they work, the legislations appear to drive the same point, which is to kind of give user the ability, the ease, the transparency on how they are managing their data. But the two frameworks are governed separately. Today, whether an AE can act as a consent manager is something that have to be evaluated very closely.
I agree. So I think if you talk about maybe one specific regulator bringing in a framework, right, then another one brings another framework. So we have seen for health also we have AVA, right, that is coming up, and then I think there are other frameworks, similar frameworks where you can kind of get specific data, right?
Yes.
So it's how industry is going to become interoperable, right? So everyone has like maybe when these standards were also defined, right? And so I've gone through standards of them, right? And they're not similar in terms of technical. So being a technical person, that is where I dig deeper. I understood that the languages that they have suggested, right, for a technical person, it's very, very different how these things should be done. So you've seen DigiLocker also, right? They also have a consent layer where they collect consent, what document is to be collected, what purpose for that document is to be collected, and all of that. And yeah, again, my question is that how interoperability will work?
So I think it's going to take a while for us to get there, right? But before we kind of look at interoperability, like you said, these systems are very fragmented today, right? You have health data that's being, there's a separate body that's looking at it. There's a STAP for agricultural data. There's, of course, account aggregate of the financial information data that kind of it transmits. The problem is that these regulators have regulated one type of data. A consent manager under the DPDP, like I said, can technically is sector agnostic. It would make all logical sense to kind of harmonize these radiations to come up with one specific technical standard and one framework that kind of governs how all these entities play out. Which, I think we may be a little far off from at this stage, right? Given that the act itself is now in force. But yes, I think eventually there will be a need to harmonize this. Do we see that happening anytime soon? Unlikely. But in the absence of that, it's going to become very difficult for a user to kind of manage their consents across so many platforms.
Exactly.
It's going to be a nightmare for the users, right? Because you have to interact with a different platform the moment your data set becomes different. And then you are practically, working across 10 different platforms to manage different data sets and what sort of consents you're given. So interoperability is important. Harmonizing these regulations is important because it's also relevant if it's the same functionality. Do they actually come within the consent manager framework? Do we need MILTI to give a clarification on how it recognizes this or does not recognize it? Or does the RBI take control over how an AA operates? These are two separate lines of authority, right? And in it from a user perspective, it becomes a little complicated, right? If I have a central law which gives me the ability to raise grievances and go to the board, today, if there is a grievance with respect to financial information, do I go to the RBI ombudsman or do I go to the board? Which authority do I go to? So I think there is a lot of consultation happening, at least to my knowledge, right, where a lot of entities, AAs, as well as multiple players that are active in the space have tried to give suggestions and have tried to look at how it's going to integrate all of this, how to get recognized. There are barriers, of course. For example, the account aggregator framework requires that an AA can only undertake the business of an account aggregator.
No.
There perhaps have to be an extension for that for it to become a consent manager. But yes, it makes all logical sense for this framework to kind of apply to all entities or for it to be restructured to make an exception for such entities so that they are outside the purview of the central law. And then the reporting authority, the disputes, the grievances lie to the relevant regulators come and speak.
Okay. So these CMPs, right, the consent management platforms, so as a data fiduciary, is it necessary for me to kind of work with them or is it optional? What does exactly the law imply?
So in short, the answer is no, it's not mandatory. The law does not impose any statutory obligation on fiduciaries to partner with consent managers. But the law brought about this concept to give users the ease in managing their consent and kind of bringing some sort of standardization and operational ease for users, right? That's how consent managers operate. There will be adoption at the user side, but more so because it kind of makes the technical aspects much easier for a fiduciary as well, right? To be able to just manage the consents, whether a consent is received, it's withdrawn, there's a request for deletion of data. I see that while it's not mandatory, and there could be hesitance, eventually, a lot of data fiduciaries might actually find it more useful from an operational perspective to kind of partner with consent managers to manage the consents for their entire user base. It makes a lot of operational ease at the fiduciary's end. There's a lot of operational ease at the user's end as well to be able to have that one dashboard and one platform that a consent manager provides to manage on their consents. And the integrations with the fiduciaries then make it easier for the fiduciaries to actually implement what the requests are. So I see the ecosystem eventually building to a place where consent managers become important. But of course, we'll have to wait for the rules to see kind of the technical standards, the requirements, additional aspects that, that will kind of impact consent managers.
Okay. So do you think this will be like a license player that these CMPs will be licensed under certain entity and they'll have to kind of...
So the CMPs, as of today, report to the board. It's going to be a board-approved process. What will be interesting is whether the kind of standards that are imposed on CMPs, consent managers, kind of match what other regulators are doing with equivalent entities. So, for example, if there's a net worth requirement, is it in line with what the RBI kind of imposes for account aggregators? Or, for example, from a data fiduciary, from a data perspective, when they're data blind, what kind of technical status they're adopting? How do they kind of interact with users? The board structures, the shareholder structures. There could be a lot of layers to this. But yes, it's going to be an approval process. It's going to be a registration process. We've got to get the board to approve you and recognize you as a consent manager. So that will be an important aspect of the entire process.
Okay, coming back to the financial sector, like a lot of our viewers are actually from that industry. So I'd want to understand where do you see the industry today? Like, are they looking at it, waiting for the law, or they have started implementing it, or getting their head around? So, where exactly do we stand as an industry?
So it's an absolute big sponge, right? And I would kind of I'll break down into three sectors, right? You have, of course, the larger financial institutions, multiple licenses, multiple regulators to kind of grapple with. You have the slightly bigger entities that may not be regulated, but may be specific to one financial service sector, subsectors to say. Then, of course, you have the whole bunch of fintechs that are a combination of regulated and unregulated. So then some activities, they are data fiduciaries. For a lot of activities, they are data processors. Now, from a compliance perspective in terms of where they stand, there are, of course, entities that want to have the first mover advantage, that have already started scouting for technical solutions that they can kind of implement. They are strategically thinking about this law because they want to be able to compete with it when it comes into place. Because, like I said, there's a lot of rehashing and rethinking and redesigning that's going to be involved. But let's not forget that there is a significant cost to all of this. There's a business customer cost, marketing cost, there's a product cost. There's also a lot of legal compliance tech costs that had it unwooded. And a lot of entities at this stage today, in the absence of clarity on where the law stands, are just not willing to kind of put in that money upfront and incur those costs as today. So yes, there are entities that do not want to comply with it till the time they are clear on what the law is, when it comes into force, rules are issued. There are entities that want to go ahead and started complying with it in the full swing, right? So the entire spectrum have different strategies and are kind of working towards it, looking at tech solutions. And then there are entities that are thinking about it, at least want to start the process somewhere, at least know where their data is, know what they collect, know where it resides, and at least get the basic data mapping done in place, right? And I think what entities forget, and I think you'll be the right person to kind of comment on that, a lot of different teams, data is very scattered in an organization. So the time that entities are taking to even complete the data mapping exercise goes into 12 to 18 months, which is a very long time to, just get the data.
So, actually, when we were talking to a few of these entities, right, what we understood is that they will need time to implement this, right? They'll need considerable time to implement this. Because right now they are first trying to figure out what are their touch points, how do they connect to customer, what kind of data they collect, where that data is getting stored, right? As you said, every department has a copy of their data that is residing somewhere, right? And they are trying to kind of understand how will they control those accesses. So, given the tech perspective, there is a lot to that also, because from an implementation point of view, it's a mammoth.
Yes.
Right? At least for organizations that are large, that have multiple departments, multiple applications, and sometimes multiple industries that they deal in, right? So how do they use, today they use data for one purpose and the same data can be used for another also, right? The marketing strategies are built on top of these data, right? So I think there's a lot that's going to change and they'll have to kind of think through how to, and you mentioned it perfectly that it's not just a legal change, or I would say a compliance change. It's a change that impacts every aspect of a business. Their whole business models might change.
And I think that's something that not a lot of players are thinking about, right? I think they're looking at DPDP as a privacy law that's going to look at consent. And I think there's a perception that it ends there. But that's just the start of it.
Yes. And I think we have not even touched the mid-sized companies and smaller companies, right? You mentioned that there's a financial cost to it, right? Getting started into this, it requires you to spend some money, spend some bandwidth of your team, right? There's a lot of mid-sized companies, startups, they'll also have to kind of figure out. And I think that's where the CMPs might kind of play a good role also, maybe open source solutions. I'm not sure yet. Yeah, I think we'll have to wait for kind of the story to unfold to understand. But yes, I thought we've not even started thinking that how small companies, how mid-sized companies, right, tech companies, non-tech companies, right, how they'll go about this, how implementation will become a possibility there, right, how easy for the whole India has to adopt it, right? So because this as a regulation, when we read the law, it seems that it will impact every company out there, every small, big, whatever it is, right? So what do you think how this will play out for smaller companies or startups or even mid-sized companies?
So I think like we said, right, there are data fiduciaries and data processors. For all entities that are processors, all their obligations will stem from contracts that decide with the fiduciaries. So yes, there will be tech development at the back end to make sure they had those security systems up and that entire infrastructure to be able to comply with what the contractor, imposes out there. But when it comes to data fiduciaries, and like you said, this could be any size. It could be a small entity. It could be a mid-size entity. It could be the larger entities. The law today does not come up with a tiered structure for compliance, right? The law, when it comes into force, will apply to all entities the way it stands. And yes, that even to us appears to be a concern for a lot of small entities because of the kind of costs it's going to take to comply with this. Will they be able to? I don't think they have an option, but can there be systems that make it easy? Like you said, consent managers partnering with them will kind of offload some part of the burden of compliance onto those consent managers, right? And I think one parallel that I could draw here that's probably not there in the DPDP as of now, right? Like, for example, the SEBI framework on cybersecurity, etc., recipes came up with a very interesting tiered structure for compliance. It actually categorized entities into different sizes and then brought about the concept of a market SOC and allowed entities that were small to actually use a market SOC for their security operations center rather than having to comply with the entire legislation and the regulation as a whole. It gave them exemptions if you partner on with a market SOC. Now, whether that sort of a concept could actually help small size entities in India, definitely. Is the meeting going to think about making compliance for small size entities easier? We have to see how the law actually unfolds.
Yeah. I think some of my conversations, what I understood is that they are definitely thinking how the companies, like mid-sized companies, will go about it. And maybe the open source competition that they launched was somewhere in that direction to maybe create an open source system that these companies can adopt.
Yes.
Right? And make as part of their systems and kind of be compliant. So to sum it all up, how do you think that DPDP will bring this openness and trust to the market, or will it kind of bring a lot of hiccups that a lot of companies are expecting? Yeah.
So I think there are hiccups every time there is a new law, right? And I think with the financial services sector, we've seen that very often. So yes, there will be hiccups. Companies may struggle to comply with it. But definitely from a data privacy and a protection perspective, it is a law that the country needed for a very long time and still needs. It's not enforced yet. But it is very important to have a legislation where users are given the ability to kind of give their consent and understand what they're giving consent for. I think this system kind of creates a lot of accountability and transparency, like you said, which is very important for the ecosystem today, given how entities misuse data. So keeping that in mind, definitely the hiccups outweigh the kind of benefits and the importance that this legislation makes.
So I think a lot of people are looking at it from the perspective of how the companies will comply to it, right? So, but there's a big angle to it from a user's perspective, right? Because given this law, if it impacts every company out there, right, there has to be an education angle to it. People need to understand what this privacy thing is, right? How do they kind of where their data is handled, right? And understanding about what exactly these systems bring to the table for them, right? To get the benefits that they actually can, right? So who will have the onus of it? Like the government will take the education part, or the companies had to kind of inform the users and educate them, okay, this is what DPDP is, and this is how it makes you more powerful in terms of your data, right? Because as an end user, as a very educated user, like some educated users might grasp it, right? That, okay, this is something that we really needed. But as a lot of users, given the masses, right, how do they understand the importance of this?
So, Pegthiuk, with time, there has been a lot more awareness about data today than that used to exist 2 years from now, right? Users are more inquisitive, want to know what's actually happening with their data and where it's going. That awareness has generally crept in, maybe not with everybody, but yes, with a larger section possibly. And this has happened because of multiple reasons, right? And different data sets. For example, with Aadhaar, the government, when it realized that people were handing out Aadhaar cards very easily, there was misuse of Aadhaar, came up with clarifications, came up with public interest notifications, content to kind of help trickle down the idea that it's an important document, don't hand it out, came up with ways to restrict companies from collecting that data. But at the same time, concerned managers, I think once that entire product and once the law is out on how they operate and what they're going to actually bring to the table for a user, will also take up, I think, a large chunk of kind of getting it across to the user on this is how you can benefit, right? Today, I have had I've had a lot of questions from people on what is the account aggregator system? Do you really think we can use it to access our financial data? And when they realize that this is how the system functions, there's a lot of trust. And I'm presuming the same will kind of extend to concerned managers, right? So it's going to be an entire ecosystem building that's going to happen at all levels.
Okay, so I think after financial literacy, it's going to be data literacy.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.